All right, here we go. This is Kinesiology 230, chapter number 23, presentation number 4. This is a talk specific to traditional and undulating models of periodization resistance training models. I also bring in some of the things I talked about in the previous example or previous presentation, where I'll talk about kind of the organization of program design. So here we are and how the chapter broke out. We're in the number 4, and then we're going to get on to some of my own presentations. We're on page 624 in the book if you want to follow along. All right. So with traditional model, let me get myself out of the way here again. It's often referred to as linear periodization, and it's kind of this gradual increase in training intensity with reduction in training volume from one mesocycle to the next. And it has its place, and it's something that's been around forever. I will tell you that when you get into working with higher end athletes, you get out of more traditional linear models and you get more into what they describe here as kind of a variation of this, where you have fluctuations in load and volume for all the different exercises, this is commonly referred to as undulating. And it has its place. It's good. You could probably get away with it for many of your like high school level athletes, but you'll find that you're going to have to kind of up your game with some of your athletes and be able to work on manipulating the rep and set combinations and the loading parameters to be able to get the response that you want. So I love these little boxes that they have, and some of them are great. And they talk about gradual decreases in training volume from one mesocycle to the next, but then a microcycle training intensity fluctuates based on alterations in training loads, but no variation occurs in the assigned number of reps, sets, and repetitions. Okay, got it. But I will tell you that, here you are in you're creating these great programs, and your athletes, instead of doing sets of 8 with the weight that you've assigned to them, they end up doing sets of 12. Well, there has to be something wrong in the process. It's either you're not coaching your athletes correctly to have them stay at 8 repetitions and they're banging out 12, or they are under the presumption that it's maximal reps all the time, and that's what they're focused on. I digress. All right, sample periodization program. Before starting a program, the personal trainer should recommend that the athlete complete a lower intensity 4 to 6 week base training program. Agree. This introductory program will allow the athlete to learn exercise technique, gain an initial adaptation to resistance training, stress. Yes, I agree. And prepare for first training cycle. I agree. Loads are typically very light, 15 to 20 repetitions. And this is where I might disagree and depart from the book, because you'll have some people that 15 to 20 repetitions will not be appropriate for what they're trying to accomplish. So you may have to actually think of this in terms of, I don't want my athlete in this hypertrophy phase of 15 to 20 repetitions. I want them more in like a base strength phase, because that's where I want to start them off. So you manipulate the actual percentages. So you keep them in the rep range that's appropriate for what they want to accomplish. But instead of doing sets of 6, right? 6 times 0.03 gives you 0.18, which gives you 82%. So instead of having them at 82%, perhaps you have them at 62%. So you have them in the appropriate rep range so the neurological system's firing appropriately, but you have the loading parameters lower so you're not blowing them out of the water. It's a real simple way to do it. So this is the one area I would depart from the book, but you will see this again, just so you know. So they have a couple different examples in the book, and I'm almost certain this is one where you see somewhere else. And these are guys that have been around forever. We have Fleck, Kramer, Stone. Actually, one of my early mentors was a gal by the name of Meg Ritchie, and she ended up marrying this gentleman by the name of Stone. So she's Meg Ritchie Stone now, long story short. But what they're talking about in terms of program design is you have hypertrophy, strength power, competition over here to the left. And they talk about 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, and an active recovery or active rest for 1 week. The set range, how many repetitions you're looking for in hypertrophy. I would say this is probably high, and I wouldn't take somebody from 30 repetitions right into sets of 6. It's too steep a slope. It really is. I would actually manipulate that a little bit more. Notice how the rest periods and the recovery time changes for different exercises. And then when we get into assigned load, we're talking, less than 85% of one rep max. Well, of course it is. You're at 30 repetitions. Come on. And over here, when you start getting into 1 to 6, you're at anywhere between 80 to 100 for 1 RM to 6 RM. So, you look at that and you go, all right, I can do the math. And I wish they would have written this a little bit differently where it was 80 to 100 and it was 6 RM to 1 RM. So you can just in your head put together there, it should be 80% with 6 RM and 1 RM should be tied to the 100%, but it's just how they wrote it. Sorry, not my fault. But the idea and the point is with this is what you have is an increase in the assigned load over time, and that assigned load is within a range of 80 to 100%. And as you go through your workouts, what you'll have is a manipulation in the actual repetition range itself. So you're going from higher volume to lower volume. You're going from shorter rest to longer rest. Think of it in terms of replenishment of ATP. And then we're talking less than 85% to greater than 93%. And your rep ranges are 1 to 3. So you can kind of just mathematically, you can sort of put like an overlay 2 different graphs there and see how reps are dropping down. And the overall volume is dropping down, but the overall intensity is going up. Typical, very, very typical type of program design. Now, when I talk undulating, you have heavy, light, power, and then moderate. And when you look at this, what they're talking about here is you have in a different phasing of heavy to light to power, and they have the sets mapped out and they have the reps mapped out. And notice it's less about hypertrophy, strength, and power and peaking. It's more about heavy, light, power. And the concept that you have with this is you still have the rest periods are manipulated, shorter rest periods for higher volume training in a light phase. And then when you're in a power phase or perhaps a heavy phase, you'll have longer rest periods for lower repetition range. What I want to point out is, and there's a question, I can't remember the exact specifics of it. I think it has to do with goal repetition range for heavy and goal repetition range for power, how one is 3 to 6 and the other is 1 to 6. So I would when you look at the test and you take the test, maybe perhaps think back to where this slide is, and you might reference back to it when you take the test, because I know there's a couple of questions on here, and they talk about in terms of, I believe there's 1 or 2 questions that are specific to assigned loads for power or assigned loads for heavy as well. All right, this is a lot to take in, but I'll just let you kind of look at this, and I'm not going to spend an hour talking about this. But if we look at this, you have a week going across from left to right, and then this column is week 1 through 16. So this would be 1 mesocycle. I might even make the argument that it might be 2 mesocycles. It might be 2 8-week mesocycles. It just depends. But it's a 15-week mesocycle with a 1-week active recovery or active rest at the end. And what you'll notice here is if you look at the sets and you look at the reps from week to week to week, and then also from day to day, what you'll find is this. Day 1 is a heavy day where you're doing 3 sets of 6 repetitions with 4 minutes of recovery in between. Here's your percents. When you have a light day, you have 2 sets of 15 repetitions and you have 1 minute of rest. But what I want to point out with this, which is a little bit wonky, is if you go 3 sets of 6, 6 times 3 is 18. If you go 2 sets of 15, it's 30 reps. But what makes it a light day is the percent of 1 RM that you're using in these workouts. That's where it becomes a light versus heavy day. 85 versus 65, 90 versus 80. When we get over here to a power day, 3 sets of 4, so your volume is lower yet than you saw in the heavy day, but it's power oriented, so you have another dynamic involved in terms of working in Olympic type lifting or power oriented lifts, and your loading parameters are yet again a little bit different than you saw over here. Then when you get into a moderate day, you have 2 sets of 10 with 2 minutes of recovery. And the question you might be asked on this is, what has the greatest amount of recovery time a heavy day, a light day, a power day, or a moderate day, it ends up being the heavy day. Especially so when you get down here into week number 15, right? So it's a lot to parse through. You don't have to necessarily memorize this, but just kind of get the context in terms of over the course of 16 weeks, how you'll go from 3 sets to 4, 3 sets to 4, 3 sets to 4 over and over again. And you go from 6 to 5s to 4s to 3s, and you can mathematically just calculate this out. 6 times 4 is 24, 3 times 5 is 15. You know, you kind of do the math in terms of what your total volume is within each week, and then compare that from week to week to week. So when they were talking about, you can see the volume parameters in a workout week or in a series of weeks, this is what they're talking about. And I just want to bring this up. This is kind of a side note. I'll rip through this. If you look at this in terms of a granular view, when somebody tells you they're really stoked to hit the gym, they're going to pound on a chest workout today, that's going to be a microcycle, very small short-term view, right? You got Monday and Thursday. I'm doing chest, I'm doing incline. I'm doing dumbbell bench press or dumbbell incline. Over here, I'm doing incline flies. But the point is, it's a microscopic scale. So you'll have one exercise here, and then you'll have exercise variation on Thursday. So while you're doing a dumbbell bench press, while you're doing a barbell bench press over here, you wouldn't do a barbell bench press here. You would do a dumbbell bench press. So if we look at mesocycle now is a little bit longer, right? We could use these. We can look at it in terms of, these are just months. You could have 2 weeks to be a mesocycle. That'd be about the shortest you could ever go with a mesocycle and call it that. 3 months or more, you know, you're getting into mesocycle. But when you get into a year or more, there is a macrocycle. And you'll see there's many different ways to implement programs within this context of having January 1, and then you get into February 1, and you get March, and spring break is the end of March. I mean, you can just think of it in terms of a mesocycle leading to spring break when you're working with your clients. So programming can include a format like, for example, where Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is cardiovascular. I'm going to run on Monday, run on Wednesday, run on Friday. I'm going to do weights on Tuesday, Thursday. And then the next month, that's flip-flop, where I do weights on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I do more cardio-oriented on Tuesday, Thursday. It can be as simple as that, and the body will never figure that out. In terms of and a mesocycle, in terms of cycle types, 3 sets of 20, 3 sets of 15, 3 sets of 12, 3 sets of 10, and then in the next month, you go from 10s down to 8s to 6s to 5s. Again, your clients will never figure that out. So over an 8-week mesocycle, you can go from 20s down to 5s. If we look at this in a different example, we can have alternating or undulating, where you have sets of 20, and you're, instead of going 20, 15, 12, etc., we go 20, skip a week 15, skip a week 12, skip a week 10, and then the undulation comes from a set of 8 or sets of 8 to sets of 6 to sets of 5, sets of 4. So instead of being linear like we saw in the previous example, we're going from higher volume to lower volume, higher volume to lower volume, while overall we're going from a higher volume environment, sets of 20 and sets of 8, to a lower volume environment, sets of 10, sets of 4. Real simple way, yet again, you can do this with your clients. So if we just kind of throw it all together into a hodgepodge here, you know, you could have over the course of 6 months, where it's January to February, you do the flip-flop where it's cardio, strength, cardio, strength, cardio, strength, and over here, strength, cardio, strength, cardio, strength, cardio. And within that context, maybe you do sets of 20, sets of 15, sets of 12, sets of 10, and sets of 10, sets of 8, sets of 6, sets of 5. And then the next month after that, you can do the undulating. It just depends how you want to do it with your client. So for program design, you know, you're not tied into specifics, especially working with the general population. But when you're working with like football players at a big level college, it becomes a little different animal. But just realize that you have the luxury to be able to kind of manipulate those variables and be able to undulate those workouts and undulate the reps and set schemes. And the one thing I didn't point out is, even when you look at this, the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, this could be chest day, or if you even go alphabetically, arms, back, chest, and then it becomes legs, shoulders, right? So you can alphabetically go right across the calendar as well. I'm running out of time, so I need to sign out. So I'm out of here.